Imagine, just for a moment, the kind of journey some children make in Kerala. Picture walking for miles, through dense forest maybe, often challenging terrain, leaving your family, your home, a home that's deep within a remote tribal hamlet.
Right.
And your destination. It's a school hostel. Now, this isn't just about, going to school. It's presented as your shot, your chance at education, maybe a lifeline to a completely different future.
A future potentially far removed from, say, collecting forest produce or other really precarious work.
Exactly. But then, picture finally arriving there. You're full of hope, maybe determination, only to find the place that's meant to give you this chance is, well, it's barely functional. It's teetering on the edge because the money needed just to keep it running has simply dried up.
And look, that isn't some hypothetical scenario we're just painting for you.
No.
That is the immediate stark reality right now for nearly 400 tribal students in Kerala. It's a situation that, frankly, demands our attention.
Absolutely it does. So today we're taking a deep dive into this specific crisis. It really centers around 7 particular hostels. There are 6 for boys, 1 for girls.
Okay.
And they're all managed under the Samagra Shiksha-Kerala program. You often see it abbreviated as SSK.
Right, SSK.
We've looked closely at the material available, detailing what's happening, and it collectively paints a really concerning picture. A system under immense immediate strain.
And with vulnerable children just caught right in the middle.
Precisely.
So our mission in this deep dive is pretty clear, I think. We need to unpack this crisis sort of layer by layer, understand the bureaucratic tangle that seems to be at the root of it all, hear about the undeniable human cost for the children, for those trying to support them, and also, importantly, look for those glimmers of hope, the resilience that thankfully still seems to persist despite these really daunting challenges.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When people think of Kerala, often the image is of a leader in education, right? A state with incredibly high literacy rates, maybe even a model for other parts of India.
And that's largely true. That reputation is earned in many ways, but tucked away in those stunning, often quite inaccessible, hilly and forested regions, places like Wayanad, Idukki, Palakkad, you find deeply marginalized tribal communities. And for these communities, just accessing the educational opportunities that might be readily available elsewhere in the state, that's a huge challenge.
And that's precisely why these hostels were set up in the first place, isn't it?
Exactly. They're part of this scheme, the Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose Awasiya Vidyalaya scheme.
Okay.
And you should think of them not just as like boarding houses. They're meant to be essential residential sanctuaries.
Sanctuaries, that's a good word.
Yeah, providing not just lodging and food, but also critical academic support. So tutoring, study spaces, maybe access to resources they wouldn't have otherwise.
Right.
Because for these kids, often coming from really sparsely populated settlements, spread far apart, where the nearest proper school might be miles away or involve navigating really difficult terrain.
Yeah, day school just isn't feasible for many.
It's just not viable. So these hostels, they're the bridge. They offer a structured path, hopefully away from the limited, sometimes dangerous opportunities within their remote communities.
And we need to be clear, we aren't talking about just a handful of kids here.
No, not at all.
The sources indicate the situation affects nearly 400 students across these 7 specific hostels.
400. That's 400 individual young lives, each one with dreams, with potential. And their educational future is currently balanced so precariously just because the system supporting them is faltering.
Which brings us right to the core problem, doesn't it? The heart of this crisis.
Yeah, a severe, really debilitating funding drought.
A drought.
Yeah, just to provide housing, food, staff, educational support, these 7 hostels together, they need a significant annual budget.
How significant are we talking?
According to the information we've seen, that figure is approximately Rs 2.14 crore per year.
Wow. 2.14 crore rupees annually, just to keep the lights on, essentially.
Keep the lights on, put 3 meals a day on the table for 400 kids, pay the rent for the buildings, compensate the staff, the dedicated staff who are caring for them.
So where is this substantial sum supposed to come from? What's the mechanism?
Well, the funding structure on paper is designed as a joint initiative. It's under the Samagra Shiksha scheme.
Okay, the SSK again.
Right. It's meant to be a partnership. So 60% of the funds are intended to come from the central government.
60% central.
And the remaining 40%. That's the responsibility of the state government, in this case, Kerala.
So 60-40 split. Sounds clear enough on paper.
On paper, yes. A clear sharing of the burden to support this critical program.
But the reality on the ground, as reported, seems anything but clear or consistent lately.
That's right. The documentation really highlights that since the second half of the 2023-24 financial year, so we're talking late 2023 onwards, the flow of those central funds has been anything but steady. It's described as erratic, unpredictable, a significantly reduced stream of money, not the reliable funding these programs absolutely depend on.
And the immediate consequences of that disruption? They're being felt right now, aren't they, at the very start of this new academic year?
Acutely. As of today, Juneteenth 2025. That's just over a week since students returned to these hostels on June 2nd.
Right. Just started back.
The hostels are essentially running on empty. They are entirely reliant on credit.
On credit? How does that even work?
Well, they're accumulating debt with the building owners for rent, which is serious enough. But perhaps even more critically, they're relying on the goodwill, the trust of local traders just to get basic provision.
Like food?
Yeah, like rice, vegetables, cooking oil, the absolute essentials.
Think about that pressure. You're basically asking private citizens, small business owners, to underwrite a government education program because the official funding channels are blocked or slow.
Exactly. And you see specific, really difficult examples emerging, like the Marayer Hostel in Idukki.
Okay.
This one hostel houses 80 students, and some of them travel from incredibly remote areas, places like Edamalakuti.
I've heard of Edamalakuti. That's a serious journey.
It can involve hours of walking through really challenging terrain. Now, the landlord there, having not received rent payments for some time,
Understandably wants the money.
understandably, he's demanding the overdue amount and has reportedly even added a 10% hike.
Wow. Imagine being one of those 80 students or a staff member there, knowing the very roof over your head is under threat because a check hasn't been signed somewhere far away.
And the perspective from the ground, from the SSK officials who are actually tasked with managing this crisis day to day, it's stark.
I bet.
They describe their operational reality in pretty vivid terms, phrases like they're basically running a charity on IOUs.
IOUs, just promises.
Just promises. You hear about this desperate routine of hostile officials constantly checking their email inboxes, just hoping against hope for that one message confirming funds have arrived, or even just some official communication about what's actually happening.
And it's not just rent and provisions, is it? The impact must ripple outwards.
Absolutely. With funds drying up, the quality, the variety of food, it inevitably declines. Staff are stretched desperately thin. They're trying to cover essential duties with reduced resources, maybe working longer hours without knowing when they'll be paid properly.
It sounds exhausting and demoralizing.
Terribly. The comment from one official really stuck with me. They said they feel like they're trying to fix a sinking ship with a bucket.
That captures it perfectly, doesn't it? That sense of futility against a massive systemic problem.
It really does. The desperation, the insufficient nature of their efforts against this overwhelming problem caused simply by a lack of fundamental resources.
And when you consider all of that, the bureaucratic delay, the funding shortages, the stress on the staff, the local suppliers, you have to bring it back to the students.
Always. They are, without question, the real victims here, caught in the grinding gears of this funding crisis.
Trying to study, trying to focus on learning.
Trying to build a different future for themselves, for their communities, all while living under this constant, unnerving shadow of uncertainty, just wondering if the hostel can even keep its doors open.
And this is where it gets particularly poignant, isn't it? The human stories behind the numbers.
Yeah. The material we looked at includes the heartbreaking story of a young girl named Mina from Nilamber.
Okay.
Her father, Mani, was tragically the sole breadwinner for their family, and he was killed by a wild elephant earlier this year.
Oh, no.
And devastatingly, it happened while he was taking her to a tribal hostel.
Oh, that's just awful.
So for Mina and her family, her education, it isn't just an opportunity anymore. It's now, more than ever, her single vital chance, her hope of breaking that cycle of poverty and hardship.
But because of this funding crisis, even that critical lifeline is now at risk.
At significant risk. That single powerful story just crystallizes the immense stakes involved here.
Yeah, it really does.
Because if these hostels are forced to close or just become uninhabitable because there's no money for food or upkeep, these kids face the very real possibility of being sent back to their remote villages.
Where accessing school daily is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
Exactly. And this dramatically increases the risk, as the sources imply, of them being drawn towards more vulnerable situations or simply losing their chance at education entirely. Dropping out becomes almost inevitable for many.
And we have to think about the emotional toll, too. It's not just the practicalities.
Absolutely not. There is a report, even from as recently as 2022, that highlighted the significant emotional trauma many tribal children already experience, just by being separated from their families, their familiar environments, when they move into a hostile setting.
That makes sense. It's a big adjustment.
A huge adjustment. Now, you compound that existing stress with declining living conditions because there's no money. Add the constant low-grade anxiety that the place providing your education might shut down any day.
It's a tremendous unfair burden for any child to have to bear while trying to learn.
Totally unfair. And it raises this fundamental question about what these children are actually asking for.
Yeah.
As one activist quoted in the materials observes, these kids aren't asking for fancy facilities or luxuries. They're not asking for the moon.
I know.
They are simply asking for a chance to learn without wondering if the hostel will still be open next month.
It's such a basic need, a fundamental right to education, really.
And it's being undermined by what looks like administrative failure, or at least administrative deadlock.
So how does a situation like this even happen, especially in a state like Kerala, known for its focus on education? This is where we get into the bureaucratic blame game.
It appears quite convoluted, yes. The scenario depicted is one where the state government and the central government seem locked in a dispute. They're pointing fingers at each other about these missing funds.
Okay, so what's the state's position, reportedly?
Well, the Kerala state government side seems to be suggesting that the center's decision to withhold or delay funds might be linked to political differences, tensions between the state administration and the national government.
Implying a political motives behind the funding issue.
That's the implication, yeah. That broader political dynamics are affecting the flow of these specific scheme funds.
And the other side, the central government's perspective.
On the other side, the central government is reportedly claiming that Kerala isn't fulfilling its part of the bargain. Specifically, that the state isn't meeting its required 40% share of the funding commitment for the Samagra Shiksha scheme.
So they're saying the problem lies with the state's contribution, not the center's 60%.
That seems to be the counter-argument, that the state needs to put its share in first, perhaps.
But what's really frustrating here, it sounds like, is the lack of clarity.
Exactly. The lack of public transparency. Or just a clear, definitive reason from either side for this specific delay impacting these hostels now.
Right.
The sources point out that neither the state nor the center has publicly provided a simple, unambiguous explanation for why the money stopped flowing consistently since late 2023. So everyone's left guessing or pointing fingers.
And the irony in all of this is just, it's stark, isn't it?
It really is. Kerala prides itself, and rightly so in many areas, on educational progress, social welfare programs.
Yeah.
Yet here we have this specific situation where tribal students, arguably among the most vulnerable groups in the state, the very people these targeted schemes are designed to lift up, are caught directly, painfully, in the middle of an intergovernmental funding dispute.
It just seems fundamentally wrong.
It does. So when we step back from the immediate crisis, the details. Why does this specific issue with 7 hostels in Kerala matter more broadly? Why should you, listening, care?
Yeah, what's the bigger picture?
Well, it matters because it touches on a fundamental principle, the idea that education is the great equalizer. Right. And that principle is nowhere more critical than for marginalized communities.
Right.
In Kerala, that includes the scheduled tribes.
And what sort of numbers are we talking about for that population?
The 2011 census figures cited put it at about 1.5% of Kerala's population, roughly 4.84 lakh people.
So a significant minority.
A significant minority, yes. And for generations, these communities have often faced systemic barriers, geographic isolation, limited access to opportunities. These hostels, they aren't just buildings. They are crucial mechanisms, proven tools for trying to break those entrenched cycles of systemic poverty and marginalization.
And they represent a real chance for upward mobility for a different life path.
Exactly. So allowing these hostels to fail, to just crumble because of lack of funding, that's not just an administrative oversight or a minor budget line item problem. It is fundamentally a failure of the idea of equality itself. It's failing to provide the most vulnerable members of society with the basic tools, a safe place to live, and learn that they need to even have a chance at success.
And if we connect this to the broader society,
right,
There must be significant costs to this kind of neglect, right?
Huh.
Economic, social costs.
Absolutely. Educated citizens are productive citizens.
Yeah.
They contribute to the economy, they participate in civic life, they build stronger communities.
Sure.
Neglecting the education of these 400 children and others like them. It could lead directly to higher dropout rates within these communities. That perpetuates poverty. And potentially, it could even have wider societal consequences.
Like what?
Well, the sources mention, for context, the concerning number of cases under the NDPS Act, the Narcotics Act in Kerala in 2024. Over 27,000 cases.
Wow.
Now, there's no direct causal link drawn here, obviously, but denying education and opportunity to vulnerable youth certainly doesn't help steer them away from potentially negative pathways or exploitation. It closes doors rather than opening them.
That's a fair point. And think about Kerala's image, its ambitions.
Exactly. The sources point to the state's booming startup ecosystem, valued at, what, $1.7 billion in 2024?
Yeah, impressive numbers.
Yeah.
And deep tech companies like Natrasemi emerging.
Right, this is impressive growth, technological advancement. But it raises a critical question, doesn't it? How meaningful is that outward success, that booming tech scene, if the state isn't simultaneously investing in its most foundational human capital?
Starting with ensuring the most vulnerable children have access to basic education and support.
Precisely. It creates this really stark contrast between the state's modern aspirations and the neglect faced by some of its own citizens.
But amidst all this difficulty, this frustration, it's crucial we also shine a light on the unsung heroes, the people who are somehow managing to keep things running despite the system failing them.
Absolutely vital. The dedication of the hostel staff, first and foremost. Working under immense pressure, uncertainty about their own paychecks. It's remarkable.
And the local traders, even the landlords you mentioned.
Yes. The local traders, the patient landlords, they're stepping up where the official system isn't.
That example from Marrier.
Yeah, the traders there supplying essential food, rice, vegetables on credit since the very start of the academic year, June 2nd. They're essentially providing a vital lifeline from their own pockets.
Trucking they'll get paid eventually.
Trusting they'll get paid while the official funds are tangled up somewhere else. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? About their commitment to these kids, to their education, its community solidarity in action.
It really is. And despite this systemic chaos around the hostels, there are still positive things happening in Kerala's tribal belts, right? Things that show the potential that exists.
Definitely. Important glimmers of hope. The sources mention the Nilamur Special Project, for instance.
What was that?
It was a project where tribal candidates received specific coaching for the Forest Beat Officer exams, government job exams.
And how did it go?
Well, in 2024, several candidates successfully passed. They secured government jobs. It demonstrates that with targeted support, these young people can absolutely compete and succeed.
That's fantastic news. Proof of concept, really.
Exactly. And there's also work being done by the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority. They're developing disaster management strategies specifically tailored for tribal hamlets.
Okay.
And importantly, they're doing it by incorporating valuable indigenous knowledge from the communities themselves.
That shows a recognition of local expertise, which is great.
It does. It shows a more collaborative approach as possible.
And perhaps the most powerful demonstration of resilience. It comes from the students themselves, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Their sheer determination, just showing up at these hostels every single day.
Facing those odds, we talked about the difficult journeys, sometimes dangerous ones.
Yeah, dealing with the constant uncertainty of funding, often being the very first in their families to pursue formal education beyond the basics.
Their commitment to learning, despite everything. It's a truly powerful force, and one that absolutely deserves to be fully supported, not undermined.
Couldn't agree more.
So what's actually being done then to resolve this specific funding crisis for these 7 hospitals? Is anything happening?
Well, from what we've gathered, the SSK, the managing body on the ground, they've been sending urgent messages, SOS letters, basically, to both the state government and the central government, pleading for the release of funds.
Okay, so they're flagging the emergency.
They are. There has also apparently been some limited financial help trickling in from local bodies, like panchayats maybe.
But nowhere near enough, I imagine.
Nowhere near the scale needed. Not enough to cover that Rs 2.14 crore annual budget required for sustainable operation. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a major wound.
And meanwhile, you see the state government focusing energy on other big educational initiatives.
Right. The sources mention, for example, the focus on implementing a new academic calendar for 2025-26. It adds an extra 30 minutes to the high school day. To ensure schools meet a requirement of 220 instructional days per year. Now, that's a valid educational goal in itself, of course.
But the contrast.
But the contrast is stark, isn't it? That focus versus the immediate existential crisis facing these hostels serving the most vulnerable students right now, it raises questions about priorities.
And from the central government side, what's the response been?
Well, there's been a notable and frankly concerning public silence regarding this specific funding issue for these particular
Really
hostels. Publicly, yes. Now, there are rumors mentioned in the context of the delay linking it to broader political tensions. Things like perceived resistance in southern states, including Kerala, to the center's push for Hindi language promotion. But those remain speculation, context reported around the delay. A clear official reason for this specific funding holdup from the central government, it seems to be publicly absent.
So, to try and bring this deep dive together, to summarize what we've uncovered, this situation playing out in Kerala, it isn't just a technical funding crisis, is it? Or some accounting error?
No, it goes much deeper than that. It feels like a profound crisis of priorities, where the educational future, the basic well-being of nearly 400 children from some of the state's most marginalized communities are hanging precariously in the balance.
Seemingly caught between unresolved disputes, or perhaps just inaction at both the state and central government levels.
Exactly. And these children, they're more than just a statistic in a report or a line item in a budget dispute.
They're the future. Potential doctors, teachers, engineers, community leaders.
Well, absolutely. Their fundamental opportunity for education, which is their clearest pathway out of entrenched poverty towards contributing fully to society. It's directly tied to the swift, decisive, and effective resolution of this bureaucratic standoff.
And the release of the funds they desperately need now, not weeks or months from now.
Precisely. The urgency cannot be overstated.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to consider. What does it truly reveal about a society's values? About its real commitment to equity? When the most vulnerable children are the first, and often the most severely, to feel the pinch of political disputes or administrative inaction.
That's a powerful question.
And what is the true, immeasurable long-term cost? Not just in budgets, but in human potential, in societal progress. When we allow talent and potential and dreams to wither and fade, not because those children lack ability or willingness.
No, not at all.
But simply because checks aren't signed somewhere, because priorities seem misaligned, or because blame games are allowed to persist over finding solutions.
It's a question that echoes far beyond the forests and hills of Kerala, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and it's definitely something worth reflecting upon.